Hello, everybody. My name is Cristina Talens, and I'm the Director of Modern Slavery Risk Assessments at the Wilberforce Institute. In today's presentation, we're going to be looking at how we conduct modern slavery risk assessments. What are the different in approach, whether you're sat behind a desk or whether you're on a site, and how we identify risks. And finally, what we're doing with these findings once we found them to manage the risks in our own supply chains and support our suppliers. So with that in mind, over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at how we use these risk assessments to carry out our due diligence on labour and human rights. I would just like to point out, and most of you will have seen this when you joined this webinar, that we are recording this presentation, but we will stop the recording when we come to the end of the presentation, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions. So you can feel free to ask the questions in confidentiality. During my presentation, you're all very welcome to send in your questions. You'll find at the bottom of your screen that you've got a little chat box, and you can write those in, and we can go through them at the end of the presentation. And either we can go through the questions, or we can, have an exchange and a group discussion. Given that we've got quite a few people here today, we may not be able to go through all of the questions, but if you need to, or if we need to, I can come back to you via email or privately. So, as I said earlier, today's session is about conducting a modern slavery risk assessment. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Wilberforce Institute, we are part of the University of Hull. We're a world-leading research centre, which was founded in 2006, and we have an interdisciplinary focus. So we have teams that come from the legal departments, history, social sciences, and education. I'm actually a practitioner. I'm not an academic. So I spend a lot of time on the road and talking to businesses and helping to support businesses. All of our team have a direct experience of dealing with either forced labor, debt bondage, trafficking and smuggling in supply chains. So we've got lots of experience of dealing with the harder end of modern slavery, but we're also experienced in labor and human rights and in those conditions that lead workers to becoming more vulnerable in our supply chains. Our risk assessment services were set up in 2014, just ahead of the Modern Slavery Act that was introduced in 2015. And we were set up specifically to address modern slavery risks with businesses, but also other organizations, knowing full well that it's a very complicated issue to deal with if you're new to it. My background, so as I said earlier, I'm the Director of Risk Assessment Services here at the Wilberforce Institute. So I lead all of the work with businesses and organizations around their operations and supply chains. But my background is actually that I'm a business person. I've worked in business for a long time. I worked in the commodities department, and I've also worked in the NGO sector. So I've worked for Anti-Slavery International, the Comité contre l'Esclavage Moderne in France, and then I've also been in Spain and Italy. Like I said, I was a social auditor. I worked in commodities for about 7 years, and I sat in a procurement team. So I've very much specialized in agriculture, and I trained as a social auditor with SGS, Intertech, and Impact Limited. So I've done risk assessments and social audits in logistics, haulage, manufacturing sites, pack houses, on farms. It's all quite diverse. I was also involved with the UN Global Programme Against Trafficking and Smuggling of Human Beings. So I was a consultant on that program in the year 2000. So just helping countries address modern slavery and trafficking between origin and destination countries, and setting up those collaborative projects between countries. And I've worked for a long time with the Ethical Trading Initiative in one way or another, and specifically the retailers and international brands that feed into that organization. So why should you conduct a modern slavery risk assessment? Well, The first reason is that under the Modern Slavery Act, you may actually have to carry out some sort of due diligence, and therefore you might have to conduct checks on your suppliers or your direct operations to see if there are any labor or human rights issues that you should be aware of and you should be dealing with. The second reason why you should conduct one is that it's probably the most effective way to identify your risks. So identify poor labor and human rights practices on the ground. Thirdly is that, if you want to provide, so if your suppliers are important to you, if you're an organization who has suppliers, they will be important to you. You want to keep those supply chains healthy, and you want to support your suppliers to fine-tune their systems. So we often find that modern slavery is not necessarily it's not easy for suppliers to deal with, and sometimes it's an industry or a sector-wide issue or a regional issue, and so they need some help in facing the problems or that they have on the ground. And fourthly, again, it comes back to actively managing your risks and globally improving conditions for workers. Nobody wants to be associated with poor labor practices or poor human rights in their operations or their supply chains. So the objectives over the next 25 minutes or so are firstly to help you understand the ETA Base Code as a labor and human rights standard, and we are just going to touch on this very lightly because you can actually access the ETA Base Code online and you can have a full read of how it works there. Secondly is to understand the risk assessment approach and the key stages that we apply within organizations and business, so how we work with them. Thirdly is to think about some solutions and the type of follow-up that you have with suppliers once you have conducted a risk assessment and how you're going to be engaging with them. And then at the end of all of this is we will try to cover off any questions that you may have and try to share some best practice. So, as I said, the Ethical Trading Initiative Base Code. So the ETA Base Code is based on International Labour Organization conventions around key themes of working conditions. So it basically covers 9 provisions. First of all is the provision around forced labor. And so the requirement is that employment is freely chosen. When we do a risk assessment, we also look at forced overtime. Secondly, it really highlights the importance of trade union, collective bargaining, or worker committees in supply chains. So there's a provision there around the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, so that they are specifically respected. Third issue that we cover are the issues around health and safety and working conditions that are safe and hygienic. But again, if I'm working on farms, there is no doubt that there might be some accommodation, and I will be looking at accommodation blocks, canteen facilities, housing providing to workers, etc. There is also the provision around transport, which is coming up more and more because people sometimes are transported over long distances and they're tired when they get onto the site. The fourth provision is around minimum age, so the requirement that child labour should not be used, and here we would be benchmarking against national legislation if it's higher than 15 years of age, which is the International Labour Organization benchmark. We look at things such as living wages and make sure that they're paid. We don't talk so much about minimum wage, although that's a legal benchmark that we use to check conditions. But we would be looking at things like in the UK, whether somebody with 0-hour contracts has enough hours in the week to be able to live off those wages. That's the kind of things that we look at as well. And also the accommodation costs that they might have if they're living on farms, etc., or the employers are providing housing. We look at things such as working hours are not excessive. So we work on a daily rate of 8 hours a day. We look to ensure that there's no more than 12 hours worked in a day, including overtime. And then we look at breaks in a fortnightly period. We want to make sure that people are having 2 days off in a 14-day period, and they're getting the necessary breaks that they need. Discrimination, that seems like a very obvious one, but discrimination can also be favoritism in conditions for workers. Then we look at regular employment and that it's provided. We don't want to see people that are being fired and rehired, so that employers avoid paying for social benefits that they're entitled to. And then finally, we look at the way that people are treated. We don't want to see any harsh or inhumane treatment. We don't want anybody being screamed at or being treated harshly. So the first thing that we do when we're asked to conduct a risk assessment for a company is that we look potentially at conducting a desk review. We work with businesses to make sure that they have mapped out their supply chains, and it can be for products or it can be for services. So, you know, we can work with manufacturing sites, or we can work with companies that manufacture something or that pack something, but we also work with the likes of facilities management companies or construction companies. We've done work with Yorkshire Water. So, you know, a lot of those businesses are dependent on third-party organizations to provide those services. So we look at mapping out all of those supply chains. Then once we've got the information from the company or the organization about the suppliers, the region where they're located, and the product or the service that they provide, we then do a Google search, basically a Google search around the supplier risks. We see if any suppliers have been mentioned by name. If they have, we give that risk a weighting of 3 points. We look to see if the product or the service has been mentioned as a high-risk sector by name. We give that 1 point. And then we look at any reports of labor or human rights issues in the region where those services or those products are being sourced, to see, you know, it could be indigenous people, it could be trade unions, it could be something that's been associated with poor practice, environmental practice within the industry. We would also include that in our desk review. And then when we have gathered all of that information, we then have an idea of where the risks might lie in the services or the products that we source. So that's the desk review. It can help a company have due diligence around their supply chains, and also help you identify where you might need to target support for a particular industry or sector. So you might see, for example, if you're working in agriculture, you might see that there's lots and lots and lots of risk in tomatoes in Italy, and not so much risk in, I don't know, aubergine in Scotland. So again, you will get that information just from doing a desk review there. Then once you have an idea of where the risks are, you can, and what type of risks there are, obviously, you can then talk to your procurement teams and your technical teams to see how you can track, how you can track that suppliers have got something in place to address those risks. Okay. Sounds a bit woolly right now, but you develop your key performance indicators around that. So you might ask suppliers, do you have a policy around the use of labor agencies? Do you have a remediation system? Do you have a whistleblowing system? Those are the kind of questions that you might want to ask suppliers where there are risks, and then you track who says yes and who says no, and you give that a weighting. Once we've got this desk review completed, we tend to ask the companies to actually conduct risk assessments on site. So a desk review is really good at giving you a global view of the issues that are going on, But an on-site risk assessment really is the best way for you to assess what those risks look like on the ground and how they manifest themselves in workers' lives. So we have a very simple risk assessment, which covers off 20 key questions, which cover the ETA Base Code provisions. Because like I said, before you get to modern slavery situation, you will have increased vulnerability of workers coming in the supply chain. We ask the suppliers what their knowledge of risk is in their sector and in their region. So we're always very careful to say it's not about your company. We just want to know how you're managing the risks that we've identified in the desk review. Very often suppliers will say there's no risks here, but that's actually quite high risk for me if they don't know what is going on in their own industry. We look at suppliers' recruitment practices. So for all of you that are working in the UK, you see it's a very, very tight labour market at the moment. We've had a massive increase in wages, obviously because of the cost of living. But again, this is having it's having an effect on recruitment practices. And there are companies that just to survive are trying to cut corners. So they might, whereas before they might have been quite diligent, perhaps now they can't quite afford to pay full wages for everybody, and they might go into hire intermediaries that are not so ethical or that are not shouldn't really be working in that field or are operating almost as informal intermediaries. We then have a site walk around. So again, we look at accommodation, we look at the places where people are working, we look at fire exits, fire escapes, we look at the provisions in place inside the building or inside the premises where workers are. And then we interview workers if we have enough time. So risk assessments are a bit similar to social audits, but they follow the same methodology almost, but they're much shorter. So they're only about 6 to 8 hours in duration, which means that you haven't got much time to interview workers. And if you do interview workers, you might end up putting them at risk. So really, most of our risk assessment on the site is done through the management interview. We're asking managers how they're handling issues that are difficult for them. We do conduct document checks, so we look at the pay, the hours, personnel files, right to work documentation, what has been gathered by the employers, and then that's an on-site risk assessment. When we can, especially if we go abroad or we're working in an industry where we need to get an overview of what's going on in the country or in that industry, we will go and speak to local NGOs, trade unions and industry bodies, just to gauge what their understanding of the risks are, what they have put into place, how they're working with suppliers around these risks. If there is work going on, you don't want to be reinventing the wheel or coming with suggestions that are not useful for suppliers. You want to actually just help suppliers collaborate with those bodies that are doing something really good. So that's an on-site risk assessment. And then thirdly, with all of that information, we then follow up with the suppliers. On the one hand, we follow up with the company or the organization that's hired us. But really, at the end of all of this, the aim is to provide support to suppliers. So we write a short report on the challenges that are faced by the supplier, and we give it a grading of low, medium, or high risk. And when we're actually there still with the supplier, we have a conversation with them about how they're going to overcome the challenges that they have. We might be able to share some learning from approaches that we have seen work in the past with other suppliers. So we might be able to talk about that. We also give some guidance on due diligence. So if their frameworks and their existing risk assessment or management systems are not up to scratch, or they're not they themselves conducting due diligence, we might say, look, if you're hiring through an intermediary, this is what you need to check. You need to check that they're paying wages. You need to check how they're managing hours. These are the type of questions that you need to ask. These are the sort of documents that you need to get to ensure that you have due diligence in place. So we give them 4 or 5 questions that they can work with to improve their systems. And then we will write normally a follow-up report for the organization that we're working with to describe the types of modern slavery risks that we have found in the sector. We'll talk about the most common challenges that have been cited by suppliers, and some of that might be procurement practices. You know, the margins are too tight, we don't have enough money to pay the wages, and suppliers have been really squeezed over the last few years. So that's not an uncommon complaint from suppliers. But that helps us then also pick up that conversation with the company that has hired us to conduct the risk assessment and to identify potential high risk areas going forward. So we're able to bring that learning back into the business. We do look at brief recommendations on management systems and then share the industry findings, you know, from the interviews that we've had with the industry bodies about what they're doing around this. So, and the last thing that we really try to do is to encourage collaboration. So it's, you know, you might be only a small company, or your supplier might be very small in the grand scheme of things, and they might not have much leverage if they want to change things. So we look at putting people in touch with one another to create leverage and to create economies of scale so that they can deal with a situation. So we're seeing a lot more of this. Even in the retail sector and in the food sector, we've got the Food Ethical Trade Network in the UK. In Spain, we have the Spanish Ethical Trade Network as well. So, you know, we are beginning to see more and more collaboration on labour and human rights issues. And I suspect it will become increasingly so because of the new EU legislation that is coming on board now. So that's nearly it. So if I was going to leave you with some next steps about how you can start your own risk assessment, etc., I would say, first of all, map your supply chains for the products and the services that you use, and conduct a desk review and a risk assessment of your suppliers based on the industry and the region where you source or you operate, and again, give that a weighting, understand the importance of that sector for you as a business, and you know, focus your on-site risk assessments with a small number of suppliers which have the biggest volume with you as a business. Okay, and then go out there, visit the suppliers and conduct risk assessments with them. If you can, interview NGOs, trade unions, industry bodies, and try to identify areas where there could be collaboration. Try to promote dialogue as opposed to finger pointing. I find that's much more useful in terms of getting things done. And finally, when you have all of this information, bring it back and develop even short bite-sized training sessions for suppliers to deal with the specific issues that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And you know, that would show that you're taking the learnings and applying them and trying to go beyond just checking issues. You know, you're trying to improve conditions on the ground.